my AP language friends. Kristian Kuhn coming at you, affectionately known as the Bob Ross of composition. And for this particular writing workshop, we're going to break down FRQ2, set 2 from the 2024 exam. And here's how this came to fruition. So as many of you know, I'm a lead teacher for the National Writing Project. And one of the things I do in my teacher trainings, especially for AP Lang and AP Lit, is I have teachers Bob Ross their instruction. And here's what I mean by that. I think it's a really good practice when teachers position themselves as the expert writers in the classroom and they model how to write, with and for their students. So they get to the proverbial easel, they get to the canvas and demonstrate how to construct these essays. And what's going to be unique about this particular writing workshop is that the teachers that I work with and my students, I'm a little different in the sense that I use heuristics versus templates. And just like Bob Ross, he used a heuristic called the wet on wet technique. For rhetorical analysis, so particular FRQ2, we use something called the declarative thesis heuristic, and I'll model those introductory paragraphs 3 times for you. So you'll see 3 teacher renditions of that. And then in terms of the body paragraphs, we use something called the syllogistic method heuristic, which is kind of seeped in the Aristotelian tradition. And I'll break down that and run you through a couple of body paragraphs. And then for good measure, I'll model how my students, tag a conclusion paragraph on the end. So that's going to be like the scope and magnitude of what we're going to do in this particular writing workshop. So let's jump in and take a look at the prompt. So it says this: Simu Liu is an actor who has starred in television shows and movies including Shang-Chi and The Legend of the Ten Rings. His 2022 memoir, We Were Dreamers, an immigrant superhero origin story, describes his experiences as a Chinese immigrant in Canada. Liu's parents immigrated to Canada from China when Liu was a baby, leaving him with his grandparents. In the following excerpt from Liu's memoir, the family's getting the 4-year-old Liu ready to reunite with his father and travel to Canada himself. Read the passage carefully. Write an essay that analyzes the rhetorical choices Liu makes to convey his message about the experience of preparing to emigrate from China. So kind of standard fare. There's nothing really in that kind of tips the hat for the students. I'm going to anticipate like a reflective tone. I'm going to anticipate probably an anecdotal story or rendition. So those are sort of some of the things that I anticipate in reading that prompt, and it holds to be true. So before we get into the introductory paragraphs, please subscribe to the channel. It's called Kristian Kuhn, the Bob Ross of composition. Tell your friends, tell your colleagues, tell your students. Let's spread the word far and wide and help me grow this thing. And as always, leave comments, hit the like, help me out with the algorithm. So students are at the exam site and they either have a blank sheet of paper or a blank screen. And they ask themselves the question, so how do I write the introduction? And as already alluded to, you're going to declare it. So again, just to reiterate this, you're going to see teacher examples here, teachers positioning themselves a la Bob Ross, modeling this for students. And here's kind of a test hack or a cheat code I got. It's like a top secret security report. In every rhetorical analysis prompt, so FRQ2, implicit in the prompt are 2 questions. And the first is, how does the author construct meaning? And the second is, what is the authorial intent? And here's what my students do for this. There's a little bit of mathematics to my heuristics. So students are going to take 3 sentences to answer the question, how does the author construct meaning? And whenever you provide an answer to that question, that constitutes and comprises the thesis statement. So 3 sentences for that. And then what they're going to do is sprinkle in a sentence about authorial intent. So some teachers talk about the exigence, the universal theme, the universal truth. So that is going to come to 4 sentences. So, come time of the exam, we can't help break down the read for students, but you may want to, depending on where you're at in your placement of the academic year. but these were cold reads. So in terms of processing and sequencing, what my students do is read, and I tell them to go hunting for the terms, devices, techniques, because in performing rhetorical analysis, that's kind of a staple. You got to be able to accurately ascertain the construction of meaning within this piece. So your choice, break it down with the kids or have them go cold on it. If we break down the declarative thesis heuristic, kind of like in graphic form, it looks like a triangle. And what the student's going to do is begin with the thesis. So out of the gate, immediately answer the question, how does the author construct meaning? And you're going to hang on that for 3 sentences. So you also got to sprinkle in a little bit of context and background, and that invariably will get the student towards the authorial intent. And then there's other bit parts to this. We do have an academic audience, so we want to see, sufficient use of tier 2 level vocabulary. And all I mean by that is your average run-of-the-mill SAT level caliber words. I tell kids, stay in your wheelhouse. You don't want to goon out. Don't, espouse the idea that if you use a million dollar words, that's the equivalent of good writing, right? It's got to sound natural. You got to have poise. And then sentence constructs is a biggie for me. So many of you know that I run my word study academy, and I also do something called a nuance academy. And a staple text in my classroom is Strunk & White's Write It Right. And within that manual, they have something known as rule number 18. And rule number 18 makes the assertion that there's 12 different ways to cobble together a single sentence. So there's 12 sentence types, but you can couple that with the idea that there's 20 sentence patterns. So you can pattern the types 20 different ways. So in order to achieve voice, rhythm, flow, myself in my models and the teacher's models that you're going to see, we're going to try to flex our syntactical maneuvers a little bit so that we're in contention for the sophistication point. I really think it's hard to achieve sophistication unless, you can cop a certain level of vocabulary and then also wield a variety of sentence constructs, because most struggling emerging writers kind of do that independent clause, short, simple sentence, and it yields that super choppy flow. And then, as I already stated, it's exactly 4 sentences. So let's break down the math one last time. 3, construction of meaning, 1, authorial intent, for a total of 4 sentences. So here's exemplar number 1. Again, it's written by a teacher. And I'll read it through from top to bottom, and then I'll break it down in terms of what's being manipulated within the heuristic. So here it goes. Principally through anecdote, Liu's 4-year-old self grapples with the firm lines drawn between family, culture, and ethnicity. Perfectly content with the love and affection he's receiving in a country and family structure that seemingly provides him with plenty, the prospect of uprooting is wrought with tension and confusion. In juxtaposing the colliding cultures, Liu makes it clear he's not interested in the material. He wants the things of family connectedness, love, and security. While Canada has a price tag of increased opportunity, material gain, and the opportunity to be with his nuclear family, the irony is clear. Liu already possesses the things that he values. So one of the trickiest things to teach is sentence patterning. So let me tell you what this teacher did here. Again, we were just experimenting within the Nuance Academy so that we have demonstrations, clear exemplars for students. So if you take a look at that first sentence, it's this teacher is doing something called a trio. So you see that there's an enumerated family, culture, ethnicity. So often professional writers will use that trio. And there's another one down below, connectedness, love, security. So that's something that forthrightly needs to be taught. And again, when students use that sparingly, it adds nice texture and nuance to the sentence, right? The other things is this. I always tell my students, don't parallel your syntax. So you got to take a look at the sentence you just dropped, look at it and say, don't repeat it, don't reiterate it, don't regurgitate it. You always have to change up your sentence constructs for voice, rhythm, and flow, with the exception being down in the bottom of the syllogisms where you're hammering home your point, or in like a conclusion paragraph. But typically in an introduction, you don't want any parallelism. The other thing you got going on in here It's just some syntactical movers with like the dash and the colon, the semicolon. Students need relative mastery of that to be in contention for the sophistication point. And then in terms of the 3+1, you can see kind of a teeter-totter balance here between explicitly stating the terms. So this teacher said anecdote, they said irony, but you also get the implicit in terms of the colliding cultures, the juxtaposition, the tension. So there's three there. There's also the one sentence for the authorial intent. And that's the whole kit and caboodle there. Exactly 4 sentences, right? So you can like, all right, I know some teachers are like, I want implicit, I want explicit. College Board's really unclear on that for the time being until the College Board gives us clear definition on that. I want my students to teeter-totter balance the explicit and the implicit in terms of naming the terms, devices, techniques. I think it's pretty skillful, and it definitely alerts the reader that there's a manifest thesis statement there. So that might be a little nebulous, a little pie in the sky. So let's run it back and take a look at teacher exemplar number 2. And I'll follow the same protocol. I'll just read it and then we'll break it down together. A mere 4 years old, Liu at an early age picks up on a central irony that often confounds adults. Family matters so much more than materialism. Told reflectively and anecdotally, he questions the dogmatic assertions that his homeland is of lesser value than the promised land of a westernized Canada, a land steeped in the prospect of material gain. Noting the paradoxical clash in cultures and ethnicities, Liu at an early age has come to an understanding of what is most important in life: loving bonds, family affection, and stability. Even his syntactical manipulations belie this fact. So again, you can see a good blend of, things like syntax, irony, right? Anecdote is mentioned, and then there's some implicit sprinkled in there again. At sentence level, this teacher, just like the first teacher, is trying that trio pattern, which you got in the last sentence. Every sentence is varied. The vocab is up. Like, this is a perfect execution of an introductory paragraph, especially in terms of getting anchored in the thesis. So I'm always of this belief. I know some teachers are like, my kids could never do this. Of course, teachers write better than students. But here's the kicker with this. Bob Ross never dumbed it down. And I really think that we shouldn't either, right? If we set a high standard, kids can climb, kids can ascend, and gradually over time with practice, kind of emulate or imitate what we're doing at sentence level, at word level, and closely approximate what we're doing. So as promised, I'm going to show you 3 introductions. Yes, you can do this, students, teachers. It ain't that hard. Simple. 3+1. Here's number 3. Noting the stark contrast between the pursuit of material gain and familial bonds, Liu, just a mere 4 years old, is not able to be swayed by the prospects of pursuing a better life in Canada. Having plenty already, love, affection, family, connectedness, so these guys were practicing their trios, he wrestles with the notion of giving these things up to transplant his roots in a foreign country with foreign people. Ironically, however, these people are his nuclear family. The point is clear. As cliche as it may sound, home is where the heart is. So one of the big things in this is that students really need to ascertain the correct meaning of the piece. They have to accurately peg down the terms, devices, techniques that are most salient and germane to the passage. And all of these teachers got that. It's a correct read. Really highlight the essential gist of the piece in terms of the terms, devices, techniques. And again, this one's doing the exact same thing. Sentence flow for the voice, the rhythm, the flow. Vocab's up, and they've identified the 3. They got the authorial intent. It's exactly 4 sentences. And that is the whole total package for a declarative thesis within this heuristic. So students and teachers, if you're painting along with us, good place to pause. Try your hand at the introduction. So we got more paper to write, right? Lots of white space, and we have to ask ourselves the question, so how do I write the body paragraphs? And as I've stated, we're going to proceed syllogistically. Let me give a quick cursory overview of this and not get too imbued in the jargon of Aristotelian logic and reason. So this, Aristotle ran a school called the Lyceum, and the townsboys would go there to learn about polemics, oration, debate, wordsmithing, word wrangling. And he noted that the good orators had tight lines of reasoning. He called it cogency. And he was like, what are these guys doing? And ultimately, he had a eureka moment. He said, aha, there's a mathematical, computative, calculative approach to the structuring of the argument, and he called it the syllogistic method. And all it is when you go from premise, conclusion. So let me give you an example. If I were to say, premise one, arsenic is deadly, you all would nod your head and say, yep, Kristian, you are right. But if I follow it up with a second premise and say, my dog ate arsenic, and I give a little context, give a little textual support, and I say, yeah, we had rats in the house, and I sprinkled some arsenic beneath my kitchen sink, and this morning I walked into the kitchen and my little dog Skipper was beneath the sink, and he came out and he had white stuff all over his muzzle and his grizzle. Your antennae would go erect and you would say, oh no, Kristian, that's not going to bode well for your dog. Your dog's going to die. And we created a syllogism right there. It's logical, it's cogent, it's a line of reasoning, right? And that's one of the things we're principally concerned with in the body paragraphs, is that line of reasoning. So as we jump into the body paragraphs, we'll talk about explicitly how to get kids to execute a tight line of reasoning with complexity, embedding the quotes, sufficient supple textual support and textual analysis. But let's break down Aristotle's heuristic and morph it into a heuristic for the purposes of doing a rhetorical analysis. So the first premise, there's some math to this, so you might want to write this down. First premise is going to be 3 sentences, and it's an argument containing the terms, devices, techniques. So there are a couple of points that I want to highlight here. If the term, device, technique was explicitly stated in the introductory paragraph, imply or use a synonym, right? You don't want any reiteration, no redundancies. That's kind of the bane of, compositional existence. And then the other thing is, I like it when students take 3 sentences. I know some teachers might find that to be contrived, but here's my reason, right? In FRQ 1, synthesis essay in the AP Lang exam, it's very clearly stated your argument must be central. And sometimes I think that we lose sight of the fact that we're doing expository writing, which is an act of argument, right? It's argumentation. So if a student begins to quote and or paraphrase in sentence 1 and 2, I find that to be a deviation from the demands of the assignment, and the kid is most likely going to do plot analysis and not rhetorical analysis, and they're going to get ding-donged in their score. So it's kind of a foul-proof way to ensure that the kids stick to the demand of the assignment if we give them 3 sentences to do that. The other thing you're going to see in the first premise is that it precludes kids from going 1 paragraph diction, 1 paragraph tone, 1 paragraph ethos, because that's too dutiful and elementary. And again, there's no way, that's complex enough or sophisticated enough for college level writing. So the 4th sentence, you transition into the second premise, and you're just going to teeter-totter balance the quoting and the paraphrasing, right? Don't do one far more at the expense of the other. And then the key thing is that body paragraphs have conclusions. You got to go back to the prompt. You got to go back to the thesis. A quick little wrap up, 1 or 2 sentences is all it takes. So I'll break this all down for you and show you bit by bit. So let's ask the question. What's a first premise look like? It looks like this. So before I read it, let me state this. Students often ask, Mr. Kuhn, where do I begin my analysis? And I always tell them this: go chronologically, go sequentially through it. So start at the top of the passage, and cross weave when necessary, right? If you can connect, like some syntactical feature, from the beginning of the passage to the middle of the passage, then it makes sense to break sequence and the chronology, but typically you go chronologically. So what you'll see my students do is they often begin with the following clause, right from the onset, comma. right? I think it's a good way to begin the first body paragraph. It cues the reader into knowing that you're going to be very organized, right? That you have a method. So let me read this and then I'll break it down. Right from the onset, Liu presents the contradictory clash between his definition of home and family versus what awaits him a few continents away in Canada. Alluding to the dogmatism of some organized religions, his 4-year-old self picks up the irony in the false promise. Nothing is more important than the love of family. Uprooting presents a strange paradox. Gaining family actually divides and subtracts from the family structure in a way that is confusing and terrifying. So, again, you can do a good blend of the explicit and the implicit in terms of stating the terms, devices, techniques. Now, when I'm working with students and teachers and we're writing, at the end of the first premise, I always ask them to do this. Can you state your first premise as a promise? Like, what must you analyze? And the answer to that question is essential to sustaining the line of reasoning. So we can see here, we got to talk about that contradictory clash, right? We also got to talk about the religious dogmatism that Canada represents. That's something really important early up in the passage. And then you got this like contradictory irony paradox stuff going on in there as well. So what we got to do is go textual support hunting. Everything that we promised in that first premise, we got to go get a quote or a paraphrase for. And this is what I mean by keeping the promise of the first premise. It all needs to be aligned. So if you stated it in the first premise, you have to have quotes and paraphrases, support and analysis in the second premise. So look how this all ties together. Immediately, Liu characterizes himself as someone whose value system is wise beyond its years, in that this Canada is actually not some sort of idyllic paradise, a place of abundant snacks and endless affection. So typically in the fourth sentence, my students begin to quote. Let me talk about embedding quotes. My students use something called the 5-word rule, and it works like this. If a student places a minimum of 5 words in front of the quote, so a minimum, not exactly, but a minimum, and keeps the quote relatively bite-sized, it should sound conversational, but as you witness in this quote, sometimes you got to bracket, you got to use ellipses. So all of that stuff needs to be modeled and taught, but it should sound conversational. Now, here's the kicker. You quote, you got to analyze. Oftentimes students drop a quote and they run like heck and they never analyze it. So look how this teacher unpacks this quote. Typically, when given the choice between the material and the familial, a small child would gravitate toward the enticement of things that bring temporal joy. Yet, however, the negating conjunctions nullify the second part of the equation, because it is not as if he didn't already have 5 amazing people around him who loved him, right? So you can get into a little bit of the syntax there, which is pretty cool. So as I broke down this passage with the some of the teachers I work with at the National Writing Project, that's something we looked at. And again, you quote, you got to analyze. An unflappable kid of just 4, Liu knows in his heart that these things are what one should value in life. In fact, the not-so-subtle duping to sway him from his position felt kind of culty, like gospel from the Church of Canadology that he was supposed to just accept, right? So if you go back to that first premise, I promised you a quote or paraphrase for that, right? The dogmatism, the religiosity that Canada represents or like symbolizes. And again, you quote, you got to analyze. Like the brainwashing of some organized religious groups, his family does their best to soften and sweeten the proposition of his impending relocation. But as the syntax belies, the math does not add up in his young mind. In factoring the variables, he welcomed the thought of meeting more members of his family, but he had no idea that said new family members would come at the cost of everyone that he knew and loved. Right. So look at how we analyze this. And I think a lot of my students, when they came back from the exam, they're like, "Crap, I missed some of the chief syntactical components of this." And the teachers I worked with, we picked up on this. The ellipses and negating conjunctions, even the legal sounding diction, not only indicate the breakdown of Liu's thought process, but also the central conflict at hand. To gain family, he apparently needs to lose his entire life foundation. So if you revisit that first premise, and you have the slides down below so you can break this down and look at it more carefully, uh, everything's aligned. All the quotes and paraphrases are germane and linked to the promise of the first premise. But as I said, you got to cross the finish line. You got to have a conclusion on this. So look at how this all wraps back to the thesis and the prompt. And again, it just takes a couple of sentences. It's a tall order for a young child to process and make sense of. His ambiguity is to be understood. Boom, ka-ching, easy, 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 easy. So again, folks that are writing at home, feel free to pause and give that first syllogism a crack. So we got intro, we got first body done. Next question becomes, what do I do next? Easy answer. You bust out another syllogism. You got to ask yourself, what's left and where did I leave off in my analysis? So the teacher's writing that we're looking at, she was at about the middle of the passage, a little beyond the middle of the passage. And when we asked about what's left, here's what we still have to do. We have the ambiguity expressed towards the father. So the ambivalence or the ambiguity, however you want to phrase that. The paradoxical clash of culture and ethnicity. So this is expressed in the attire and the meals that are described. You got a lot of syntactical stuff still going on here. The dashes and ellipses are really cool. And then you have that allusion to Eric Foreman, the Asian Eric Foreman, the celebrity, the unknown, the unknowable, the foreign father. So that diction and that allusion is pretty important. And then the diction of the child when he uses the father's formal name in the first interaction he has with them. I think that's important as well. So all of that can go into the first premise. And then what you do, you write that first premise, go fetch your support, make sure everything's aligned, that you keep the promise of the first premise. And then you're shooting for like 10 to 12 sentences, right? That's the typical length of a syllogistic body paragraph. So that'll take care of body paragraph number 2. But we still got to wrap the essay up. Let's talk about conclusions. So early in the year, I introduced the idea of some sentence stems for conclusion paragraphs. Ultimately, come time of the exam, I find them to be kind of hokey, training wheel, too scaffolded. But some of my students in time situations, they panic, they freeze, they're slow eagers, and they just need to finish up. And ultimately, the conclusion paragraph I compare or liken to the grand finale of a fireworks display, right? So you're hammering exigence, theme, main point, right? Universal truth. So any like all encapsulating clause or statement, like simply said, evidentially, in no other words, when it's all said and done, at the end of the day, gets you to that wrap up mode, that big encapsulating, all encompassing sort of statement. So we got one model for you. Again, it just takes like 3 or 4 sentences real quick. In no other words, a young child's intuitive and instinctual nature is to be trusted. Not only are Liu's priorities in alignment, but his value system is maturely rooted in what matters most in life. One's core identity is deeply anchored in the things of love, family, and the human bond, not the false promises of the material world. And that's kind of like the whole ka-ching of the piece. So I'm going to sign off. Happy teaching, happy writing. If you need to reach out to me for any reason, you can drop me an email at teachingwritingcoach@gmail.com. Also, I have a website, and in that website, you have information on all the professional development that I offer, the webinars that I'm hosting, and just my comings and goings within the ELA circuit. So I'm pretty active in there. And one of the things I'm doing over the next few months is something that I'm calling the Teach It Right 5-week one-to-one mentorship. So with my work with the National Writing Project, typically we would have like 10, 15, 20 teachers in my 5-week mastermind. And at the end, most teachers would say, man, oh man, Kristian, I really wish I could have taken that one-on-one with you, or you could have worked, exclusively with our department. So I'm offering that possibility. And we can go over anything that you want, my Word Study Academy, my Nuance Academy, the heuristics across the expository modes, my alternative grading methods. We'll, tailor custom make it to your course load, your district, your curriculum. And what we do is, the schedule's pretty flexible. We work around your schedule, my schedule. We meet 5 times for 90 minutes apiece and just work through all that stuff. So you'll be really equipped, to bring these heuristics and this, level of modeling to your kids. So it really, really is important to, embrace your inner Bob Ross so that you demystify the writing process for your students. Another common point of feedback was, Kristian, I'm a teacher. I don't have time for this PD stuff. So I made a self-paced course. It's super thorough. It's like 10 videos. Each one's like an hour a piece, and it takes you through all the heuristics per expository mode. It's got AP Lang, AP Lit, alternative grading, word study, nuance. Pretty thorough. Look at my webpage. It's pretty thorough in its description there. Or email me, and I'm more than happy to hop on a Zoom call to walk you through that. And then often throughout the academic year, I offer my alternative grading method, 2-hour intensive. And I've done this with Perfection Learning, NWP, many times. And again, teachers, the main point of feedback is, Kristian, I really want to work one-on-one with you or with our department because our needs are so specific. And ultimately, we can go through this one-on-one or with your department so that you can reclaim your evenings and weekends, because I'm a firm believer that the traditional grading paradigm is hooky. It's not the most effective way to do things. And it's a super time suck, as you know, and it gives us a lot of unpaid compulsory overtime, which I don't like. I like working my contractual hours. So anything in terms of questions, teachingwritingcoach@gmail.com, and I'll be happy to respond to you. So that's it for this one. I'll do the rest of the exam. I'll record set 1 and set 2 for the 2024 AP Lang exam. So subscribe to the channel, and all that stuff will be posted in due order. Take care.